Good afternoon. My name is Vyshlinsky. I'm the Executive Director of the Center of Economic Strategy. Welcome to our monthly review of the Ukrainian economy during the war. This is the project that we started back in 2022. In the first months of the war, throughout 3 years, we have been working together with the German economic team. This time we are running this event independently but open for future partnerships in the preparation of these monthly events and economy reviews. We have not changed anything significant in our own format, and it foresees that we have a topic of the month, and this time our topic is absolutely evident. That's what is happening with the Ukrainian budget, the deficit, the assistance from the partners, the budget declaration. I would also add changes to the budget. Quite a lot of news were connected with about the Ukrainian budget throughout the last months. In January, the government proposed to increase the state budget of this year by almost 450 billion hryvnia. The overwhelming majority will go to the defense. Covering new expenses is at the internal revenues. Also, the government revisited the declaration for the upcoming 3 years. This is the strategic document that sets for the short-term perspective the budget revenues, and they have also started quite active discussion which support in the upcoming years we can receive from the international partners to make sure that the country could keep afloat during the Russian armed aggression. This is something that we will discuss in our special part about the budget, where we will have today a very interesting female speakers rather than male speakers. But let us start, as usual, from our review of the economy for this month, which new data we have. Once again, let me remind you, according to the procedure, we have simultaneous translation, Ukrainian, English.
Please switch in the menu if you wish.
And in case you have any questions, it would be the best if you put them in the Q&A section, because technically there is a possibility for speakers to reply you in detail in case, for instance, your question will lack time to be responded. So let me now pass the floor to my colleagues for the economy review. In the first place, the first will be by Maria Semilina, who will talk about the situation in the monetary and FX sector and prices. Welcome. So let us start from the good news. For the first time for almost 1 year, started to fall down. This was as expected from the National Bank, that will come to a certain peak as of June, and then some gradual decrease of the inflation will continue. So the inflation fell to 14.3%, while the prices grew by 0.8% month to month. This decrease is connected with the high base for comparison from previous year. For comparing administratively regulated prices, the highest price increase was registered in June among fruits and railway passenger transport. So in the upcoming months, we suggest that inflation will continue to decline. And if we talk about the key policy rate, it is still at the level of 15.5%. The next meeting of the NBU is expected at the end of July, and very likely that the key policy rate will remain at the same level, at least for the foreseeable future. In case we look at what is happening with international exchange reserves, they have grown as at the beginning of June. Sorry, as of the end of June, they are $45.1 billion. This increase was driven by large inflows from international partners They exceeded the NBU's net FX sales and Ukraine's FX debt repayments for interventions and to cover our obligations in foreign currencies. The reserves are sufficient and they cover 5.6 months of future imports, which is a very good indicator, while the minimum level is believed to be at 3 months. Also in June, we saw a relatively stable demand net FX, and the foreign currency interventions were around 3 billion. If we talk about the exchange rate itself, we're saying that the official hryvnia rate remains quite stable to US dollar, while to euro it is at its peak, which is because of what is happening in the foreign currency market between US dollar and euro. And lastly, we didn't talk for a long time what is happening with the deposits and loans. In general, the demand for hryvnia term deposits remained strong. And it's actually growing, both for short-term and long-term loans as well. And we talk about deposits, they are actually also in good demand. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to say that very recently we presented a very interesting research results in terms of what is happening at the lending market, especially in the corporate side. What is the impact from demand, offer, volumes of lending? So it's of interest to you. Please look it up on our website. This is it. I would like to pass the floor to Hlib. Thank you, Maria. Very happy to see this line on the graph, hryvnia corporate, which is growing, stable. And once again, I would like to advise everybody to look at the report, which is quite interesting. We were working together with our German colleagues on that report, and we were discussing it with the National Bank as well. But let's come back to our topic. Next, I would like to pass the floor to Andriy Yakimenko, who will talk about the added value in the economy and most interesting sectoral tendencies. Andriy, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Let's continue the overview of the sectoral analysis for the main macroeconomic indicator. So, within the first quarter of 2025, GDP increased by 0.9% compared to the previous year. Same period, the pace of the recovery of the economy decreased, and taking into account the permanent shelling, logistical difficulties, war risks, labor shortages, we believe that the growth of the economy will be quite limited in the upcoming days and months. Ukraine's economy remains around 80% of its 2021 size. That means that Ukraine's economy will require quite a long recovery phase before it can move to a sustainable growth. For the time being, the energy crisis that happened last year, we are gradually moving out of it. There is the absence of significant shelling of the Ukrainian electrical stations and the favorable conditions, which are actually in June 2025, -2 degrees versus June 2024. We were able to accumulate enough electric energy and for the first time in several years to have bigger exports versus import. In the end of June, there was the Ukrenergo competition result. The new head of Ukrenergo, Vitaly Zaychenko, he's now a key figure in wartime grid operations. He wants to get out of default for green bonds. In July, the ENTSO-E raised Ukraine's electricity export limit to 900 megawatts. which will allow us to have a better balance of the system during summer surpluses. The agrarian sector is in the transition mode. Last month, we completed the action of the autonomous agrarian conditions meant to give better conditions for Ukrainian farmers. In June, Ukraine's exports of grains and oilseeds dropped by 20% to amount to 2.5 million tons, which is the lowest result over the 3 years, comparing the volumes of exports for the first half a year of 24 versus 25. So we can see the decrease is almost 42%. At the same time, on June 30th, the European Commission announced the so-called DCFTA 2.0 revision of the existing free trade agreement. And as was mentioned at that time, the then Minister of Economy, who is the Prime Minister now, Yulia Sviridenko, the update raises quotas on honey, sugar, and poultry meat. So quite a lot of groups received bigger quotas. And although the new limits still remain binding, the new terms will significantly reduce tariff costs. Full liberalization is expected by 2028, and new agreements are aimed to make sure that this pathway would be stable and predictable. Thank you. Passing the floor further. Thank you, Andriy. Basically, the next block of information is a new section which we have added to our monthly review. This is a new face who will be presenting this block, Lazar Levchenko, our economist. He will talk about the situation in international trade. This is something that Andrei has already touched base. Lazar, the floor is yours. Welcome. Thank you so much, Hlib. In terms of Ukrainian exports, in general, the preliminary data that we have about Ukrainian exports for January through May 2025 show the drop in exports by 4.5% year on year compared to the same period in 2024. And we can see a certain stagnation at approximately the same level. Also, the main drivers of this drop are the decrease in agricultural exports, particularly the drop in oilseeds and grain cultures caused by poor harvests and targeted Russian attacks on infrastructure connected with agriculture and logistics. In accordance with the latest report, Global Rights Compliance, the Russian attacks have destroyed more than 100,000 square meters of grain storage facilities, which is like 15 football FIFA soccer fields. Also, metallurgical exports somewhat declined due to a slowdown in the construction sector and structural changes in the Chinese economy, and the slowdown in their sector, which reduced the global demand for metal. In terms of imports, in here we are observing a significant growth by 16.5% in 2025 with the same period of 2024, which is explained mostly by the increased, significantly higher imports of gas, generators, transformers, and related goods, which can be connected with the decreased capacity inside Ukraine. Also, the products of double use and the so-called defense products, they increased, which we can observe in the category other, and connected intermediate goods such as electronic modules, components, radio electronic subsystems. At the same time, the imports of the consumption goods basically did not change or even slightly dropped. Also, we can consider the Ukrainian export as any other trade flow, as the change of two components of exports. This is first of all the change in the price and change in the amount of the exported goods. And we can break it down to change in exports, to the change of price, and in terms of change in the exported volumes. So we are seeing that since the beginning of the year, as my colleagues have already mentioned, because of the slowdown of the industry, of the economy growth and slowdown in the agricultural sector, we are seeing real slowdown, but it's partially compensated by the better prices to goods which are exported by Ukraine. That's why the price since the beginning of the year is partially compensating the effect of fall when we talk about exports. Thank you so much, and passing the floor back to you. Thank you, Lazar. Let's see the last slide. I have not looked at this analysis for quite a long time. Now I understand why Ukrzalizny is feeling so bad, because it's very quite disproportionate to exports, because the physical volume significantly decreased more than exports. And in general, we see that there are no such big figures of growth like what we saw last year. And this is for the topic which we are gradually entering via the presentation of our economist, Oleksandra Mironenko. So in terms of the budget, that means somewhat a complication of the situation, because when the economy is starting to slow down, then the budget revenues also don't grow as quickly. But whether I'm right or not, Sasha, please tell us. Yes, thank you so much, Hlib. Let us move to our special topic, what is exactly is happening with the Ukrainian budget. And let us start with the change to the law on the state budget. So in the end of June this year, the government proposed to increase the state budget expenditures, taking into account the bigger needs of the army. Such reconsideration was quite bad tradition, because we already had such revisions in 23 and in 24. Although the army needs and the defense sector are quite difficult to foresee, this repeatedness actually says that we should not be very much optimistic. They are too optimistic in the beginning, which doesn't materialize in the end because of the fewer international assistance. That's why the government has approved the changes to the budget, and with the general increase of taxes by 449 billion hryvnia in total spending, of which 412 billion will go to the defense and security sector. This is almost plus 20% of the defense budget and about 10% of the total expenditures. Apart from the expenditures for defense, they also increased by 36.5 billion, and the total increase was almost 450 billion hryvnia. We are planning to cover it with the main source of funds, its savings, decreasing payments for service of the debt. The next source is the increase of the internal revenues, internal borrowings and foreign borrowings. So what is happening with the revenues? Based on the new plan, as of this year, the revenues should amount to 2.5 trillion hryvnia. This amount does not include direct aid to budget entities, the defense aid, and part of the total war expenditures. And this plan envisages quite a conservative grant component. So within 5 months of this year, the budget has received almost 1.5 trillion hryvnia in revenues, which is already the overfulfillment of the plan for these 5 months. That is also 43% bigger compared to the same period in 2024. Own tax revenues to general fund increased by 21% versus previous year, and the biggest dynamics is shown the excise tax collections, which is connected with the growth of imports of the excised goods, such as tobacco, as well as the increasing control over the excised goods. And in accordance with the changes to the law on the budget for this year, some additional expenditures for defense are planned to be covered by overfulfillment of internal revenues. This should be possible without increase of taxes or some additional decisions, because we can see within even these 5 months, in terms of fulfillment, such as the personal income tax, the corporate income tax, the income from dividends, and the imported excise tax for tobacco. When it comes to international assistance, it is also has grown both in the form of grants and in terms of the defense aid as munitions, and in general this amount for 5 months is almost $500 billion hryvnia. With this, the yearly forecast is quite pessimistic and envisages the decrease of the international assistance as of the end of the year, which we'll be seeing in the end of the year. When it comes to the expenditures, of course, the main priority remains the expenditures for the defense and security sector. In general, based on the updated plan of the budget for this year, together with the changes, the expenses should be 4.4 trillion hryvnia, out of which some 57% is the expenditures related to the war. So within 5 months of this year, the state budget expenses amounted to almost 2 trillion, which is 46% of the adjusted plan, or 5.5 months of expenditures. The biggest growth we saw for military spending, both at the expense of domestic sources, plus 35%, and international aid, so the international aid has also grown. Apart from that, we have seen the growth, the debt servicing expenses by 34%, which is connected with the overall increase of the state debt, which since the beginning of the war has grown by 2.3 times, and as at May 2025, the public debt amounted to 7.5 trillion hryvnia. Nevertheless, other expenditures remain almost the same, while the social expenditures even slightly have already fallen by 80% less within 5 months of this year compared to the same period of the previous year. And this tendency is not temporary. Until the end of the year, we are expecting the general decrease of social sphere expenses by 7%, which is connected with the limited financial resources, especially in the context of international assistance, which has the overall tendency to go down, while the defense expenditures, the social sphere, unlike defense, is financed at the expense of the donor's assistance. So what is happening with the deficit? When it comes to the updated deficit, together with the changes to the state budget of this year, and according to the increased costs for defense, we're also expecting that the nominal deficit in the end of the year will be relatively less than in 2024 and in 2023, and will amount to 22% of GDP. With this, within 5 months of this year, we are seeing the increase of both the nominal value and the relative value of the deficit of state debt, taking into account grants in revenues. Within 5 months, it was 6.8% of GDP, while 6.6 versus 6.6 in 2024. So with the current increase of the deficit within the 5 months, the overall yearly deficit will be lower than the previous year. And when it comes to financing budget and medium-term planning, within 6 months, the state budget has received almost $22 billion of international financing. The biggest part is some preferential loans via the ERA mechanism, which is a conditional debt obligation which has to be repaid and served by the frozen Russian assets. With this, we see the downward trend in grant financing, which we have received some $400 million from the European Union, and this is almost 3 times less than the previous year. With this, we even didn't fulfill all the beacons within Ukraine facility, and that's why the state budget will not receive some €500 million in grants. And in the context of this general decrease of international assistance, an important topic becomes the foreseeable, predictable fiscal policy in the upcoming years. For this, in the end of June, the government has approved the budget declaration for 2026-2028. Submission of this declaration is one of the structural beacons for the IMF, which we had to do, and we completed it by the end of June. Nevertheless, last year we also submitted the state declaration, but it was not approved by the parliament. So whether this state declaration, this budget declaration will be adopted and approved, we'll see very soon. So what will happen this time? This is not already. This declaration is looking at two scenarios, the basic and the alternative. The basic scenario envisages a significant improvement of the security situation and correspondingly improvement of the economical situation, speeding up of the economy, decreasing of defense costs, and in general models quite a positive range of events. And the alternative scenario is looking at a less optimistic scenario with more hostilities. So the negative scenario is not very much detailized, and tendencies on the slowdown of the economy, price pressure, and the further decrease of non-military expenses. Again, on which scenario the budget of the upcoming years will be based, it will depend in the first place on the situation on the front, and this we will see in due time. Thank you very much. This is it from my side. Thank you very much, Alexandra, for this detailed review. One more minute of advertisement from me. You have mentioned about the problem which is coming in August, the under-receipt of funds within Ukraine facility. This is the European Union program financing, which is connected to reforms in Ukraine. On the 31st of July, we are planning an event within RR4U. We will discuss in detail how Ukraine fulfills the conditions which we have undertaken to fulfill the obligations in front of our international partners, and why exactly we're seeing this decrease and deterioration and what we should do with it. So let us now come back to our big budget topic. I would like to present our today's participants who will discuss together. We have a very strong group of experts and officials. I will mention you in the order that I will pass the floor to make sure you will also understand who comes after whom. So the first will be Roksolana Pidlasa, the parliamentary and the head of the budgetary committee of Verkhovna Rada, Olga Zykova, deputy head of the Ministry of Finance of Ukraine, who is responsible for the international activity of the ministry. I'm very much thankful to Roksolana and Olga that in the week of so huge political changes, you still could find time and join our planned discussion of the budget, because the changes in the budget, in the government, these are the changes in the government, but the money is needed every day. So next, we will also ask to take the floor Gavin, the head of the mission of the IMF Fund in Ukraine, who is the key among our international partners in evaluating the financial resilience of Ukraine, our financial needs. We really appreciate your role. And in the end, Olena Bilan, the head of the research of the main economist of Dragon Capital, member of the supervisory board of our center. She will summarize our discussion. And now let's start from the conversation with Roksolana, and let us start from the issue connected from where Alexandra started in her presentation in the first slide. Why exactly, once again, we are forced to make such a big review of the budget inside the year, in the middle of the year? Is this really inevitable, or whether it's possible next year we will have a better planning, or is this at all the last revision of this year? Roksolana, please, the floor is yours. Unmute, please. Apologies. Good afternoon to everybody. Many thanks for the invitation. In case you allow me, I will comment one thing from the previous report about the budget declaration. It's important to understand that the budget declaration is approved by the government and does not require the approval of the Parliament. So the document that is provided to the government, we can do the recommendations, but it's final anyway. In terms of your personal question and in terms of the practices of changes of the state budget inside the year, in the middle of the year, I don't think it's a question about bad planning. I don't think it's a bad practice because the war is always the field of big uncertainty. And both the government and the parliament are forced to respond very quickly to the needs of the front and adjust the state budget in accordance with the request of the military. In 2022, we introduced changes to the state budget for more than 10 times, and this was all everybody responded okay with this. Apart from that, in October 2024, before approving the budget for 2025, the Security Defense Council was the highest military and political leadership of the country. They approved a decision on the volume of expenditures which should be envisaged for the needs of the defense. At that time, this was 26.3% of GDP. This was 2.2 trillion hryvnia. And we foresaw that, but in 2025, we saw several processes that impacted on the execution of the budget. I think many at this Zoom knows and can talk about it, but for the protocol, as they say, for the minutes, let's fix in the first place, this is the delay and decrease of the supplies of munition and other military materials. Then we had more active hostilities. If you remember, in the beginning of the year, some special dedicated political decisions were made to increase the social protection of the military. So the government, represented by the Minister of Finances in the first big half of 2025, used the money that was planned to pay the labor of the military to procure weapons and munitions. And now, to make sure that the sector of defense and security functions normally, we should add these funds that were spent before earlier than it was necessary. Actually, earlier than it was planned because they were spent when they were necessary. Roksolana, please, just for our understanding, let's discuss the procedure. So these changes are already adopted in the first reading. When can we expect the second reading, taking into account that this plenary week has finished, the key decisions are taken on the 19th and 20th of August. Clear. So in essence, the parliament showed its political readiness for such changes, but the final decision, which could be taken into account by the Minister of Finances, they will still take 1 month. So far, it's like this, but then on the 22nd of July, we will get together to vote the draft law on Ukraine facility. So that's where we also expect progress. That's also very important for the financing of our needs by our international partners, especially European partners. So let's now have some mode of interview because Roksolana will be forced to go to a different meeting, so we could try to put all the questions that we have for you and which basically pertain to the work of the Parliament and your personal evaluation as the head of the Budget Committee. So let's come back to the draft law. What shall we use to finance this additional 450 billion? To which extent do you believe that the proposals about the revenue part, how realistic they are, and how do you think whether this additional 185 internal borrowings are realistic, and whether at all this is a good option in your opinion as an economist, not only as a politician, taking into account those figures that were shown by Alexandra about increased costs for servicing the debt. Is this inevitable and is this normal? We simply don't have any other way out. Let's go one by one. In terms of revenues, it's important to understand in the first place that we approved the draft law, which is alternative to the government's one, and that's why we're increasing planned revenues to 155.5 billion hryvnia, out of them 147.5 billion that were planned by the government, plus 8 billion, that's the income tax that was credited to the budget of the city of Kiev, and now there is the proposal, it's already approved, to credit it to the state budget. But in case you want to realistically evaluate these revenues and this plan, we should look first of all at the justification for each specific line of the budget, because in the first place, for instance, the biggest growth is planned for personal income tax and military levy by almost 56 billion. This is explained by the fact that in 2025 they are applying the bigger rate of military levy, 5%. So in the first half a year, we can see that by more than 20 billion, they have already overfulfilled this figure. So definitely this is realistic. And apart from that, also in the second half of the year, it's very often the volumes of revenues in terms of personal income tax are bigger. So no question about it. And then you should go down by each other tax. So this personal income tax plus this 8 billion from Kiev, this will be altogether 32 billion. There is also an overfulfillment in the first half of the year. So in the second half of the year, there will be also bigger volumes, because this is the seasonality in the payment. Okay, sorry that I interrupt you. I wanted to clarify about this redistribution of this personal income tax, where 10% of the tax remain in the local budget. We understand that Kiev has won a lot from paying the tax by the banks, corporate income tax, and the Kiev got it since all the banks are registered in Kiev. To my shame, I was not reading this proposal, whether this is only from the moment of adoption, or this will be a redistribution of something that already has been paid in the first half a year 2025. In the addition that was supported by the Parliament in the first reading, we propose to do this starting from 1st of August, to credit this 10% of the personal income tax that used to go to the local budget of Kiev, to redirect them to the state budget. The logic is the same as the one that we discussed about redirecting the military income tax, personal income tax, to state budget. Because if you look at the reporting in terms of revenues of the city of Kiev, you can see that in 2023, the budget of the city of Kiev from the bank's corporate income tax, they received only 426 million hryvnia in the first half a year, while in 2024 this was more than 6 billion. This year, according to the operative information, this will be 5.5 billion hryvnia expected of taxes. So this is the money that we can say are unexpected income for Kiev, which deserve to be redirected into the reserve fund to make sure that the government could make good use of them. Good. Let's come back to the question, what's about with the internal borrowings? Do you think this plan is realistic and inevitable? Yes, and there are two reasons for that. In reality, in the first place, the approved plan approved by the state law for the internal borrowings, it's around 580 billion hryvnia. This is the amount that is less than the factual borrowings that took place previously year. Last year, the state could place government bonds for some 638 billion hryvnia. And secondly, we are now observing such a tendency that Ministry of Finances absolutely conscientiously borrows much less than what they planned to do. If I'm not mistaken, that's like 11% from their primary plan for the first half a year. That is, we are borrowing less to make sure we would have the possibility as the state until the end of the year, in case necessary, to place more into government bonds. Good. Another small question before we slowly move to our external financing. And this will be somewhat the question to you and mostly to Olga. So the last question about the draft law and revisiting of the budget for this year. What is your feeling? You already have your good understanding of the differences to the budget, changes to the budgets. You really understand the figures really well. With the situation that we have at the front, in case it pertains, in case it stays, would this revision be enough, same as last year, or whether we will be limited only to one revision that we have now, and we can live with this budget until the end of December? Let me reply diplomatically, but to make sure we could make another revision, or at least half of such revision, and increase revenues for defense, we would need to approve some more creative decisions and solutions in terms of increasing the own revenues of the state, because defense is financed only with own funds, apart from the funds that are coming from Great Britain. So I will translate from diplomatic to normal language, increasing of taxes. No, 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 no. Let's put it this way. I'm sure that at this Zoom we have representatives of the media. No, we are not planning the increase of taxes. Definitely. Good. Fine. Then you have kept the intrigue in terms of the creative decisions. So the last question to you before we move to Olga. So the representatives of 2026, since on the 19th of August you will close the issue with 2025, and you would need to plan the budget for 2026. Mr. Gavin from IMF is playing a very key role with us when the country is in the IMF program. Without the International Monetary Fund, no single planning is taking place. We will also see this from Mr. Gavin, but also how is your vision? What is your vision in terms of the needs of external financing for 2026? I'm not talking so much about figures, because of course Olga will talk about the figures. So your overall feeling, and in particular we had one of the questions during registration, which share of the budget deficit in 26-28 it is planned to cover at the expense of the external borrowings. So which opinion you have here outside of what will be told to us by Olga of what is happening directly in or by the hands of the Ministry of Finances, which negotiations they run? In the first place, we don't have any basis to say that the need in external financing for the upcoming year is going to decrease. Even the former Prime Minister, Denis Shmyhal, said that the needs will remain at the level of more than $40 billion. You do know very well, and this was also announced by Ursula von der Leyen, that she is concerned with the issue related to the closing the gap. That's $19 billion. But I think that this should not be only a problem of the European Union. And here, taking advantage that we have Mr. Gavin Gray online, I would really love to say that we are expecting from IMF the continuation and maybe the increase of the support in 2026, because, as an example, as the parliamentary, I can have some attention to this. In 2025, the IMF has approved the program of cooperation with Argentina for $25 billion, out of which $12 billion were the initial disbursement. I just want to remind you that to make sure you should get more than $6 billion, Ukraine had to go through 8 reviews of the program. That's why I see a great potential, a big potential for the cooperation with International Monetary Fund and other donors of the Ukrainian budget. And when it comes to the ratio, well, I don't think there will be any changes in 2024 and in all previous years of the full-scale invasion. For more than 70% of the state budget financing constituted international support. And until we don't complete active hostilities, this is a situation that is likely to stay. With this, we conscientiously do less borrowings via government bonds. We discussed that already with you. Thank you, Roksolana. I really hope that you can stay with us for some half an hour. In case you have any more comments, please raise your hand. I will pass the floor to you. And now I would like to ask Olga Zykova. We already understood that the question of the external financing is key. And the first question to immediately allow me to close the issue related to the 2025, because our events are quite professional and the majority of those present, you understand that our needs are covered for 2025 and nothing especially interesting we will not find out, because thanks God everything is all right, but still there is quite an uncertainty in terms of 2026. Some 1 month ago the Ministry of Finances said that there are also needs in covering some 10-15 billion hryvnia. There was also an announcement about 19 billion hryvnia. That's what we heard from some sources from the European Union. But I would understand that we have basically 2 periods, 26 and even 2027, because 2026 we still have some balances, and I would like Olga to talk in more detail about these balances, how in general this picture looks like for 2026, but for 2027 the balances become much less, and then starting from 2028 there is some hope for some new big financing from the European Union. So let's start from 2026 and let's talk about 26-27. Maybe there is in this area, there is some creative solution, not only in the area for which the people's deputies, the parliamentaries are responsible. Olga, the floor is yours. Thank you, Hlib. It's a pleasure to be among such a great team. Very happy always to join in. In reality, many thanks for the review that was already given by our colleagues, by your colleagues, both by experts of Central Economics Strategy. And I'm very much thankful to Roksolana for a very clear overview of what is happening with the budget at the moment. This year, of course, we're very happy to say that the need for external financing is closed by the so-called hard commitments. We have some obligations that will be materializing in full to the fullest. We, as the very realistic and very pragmatic ministry, we always evaluate the risks. So taking into account the war is still ongoing and the aggressor continues to attack at the battlefield and from the skies. So we have to understand that the previous evaluations of the financial needs of Ukraine have to foresee several scenarios for the development of events. This should be both as the scenario of completing the active hostilities as well as the scenario for the continuation of active hostilities. Of course, definitely, we are all coming to the point that we have a victory and then the war would finish ASAP. But once again, talking to our partners and having very specific discussion, both with EU as well as with the G7+, And with the IMF, everybody is interested how the structure of the state budget would change depending on the security situation, what will be the deficit of the budget, and how Ukraine plans to close the needs in both cases. So we are talking now that in accordance with the IMF program, in case of the completion of active hostilities, we will target of 9.9% of GDP for the deficit. At the same time, we understand that the threat from Russian Federation will continue, and Ukraine will require automatically some additional resources to preserve the defense potential and for maintaining enough defense power for any potential new risks. In case we're talking about the second scenario, when we are talking that these are the scenarios where the war is possibly going to last in 2026, then the defense expenditures shall stay at the level of 2025. With the changes that we discussed today, that is, in case as at of now, we're talking about the deficit of more than 22% of GDP, taking into account all potential conditions of growing economical and at the same time preserving the adequacy of defense expenditures. We understand that in 2026, in case the active hostilities remain, the deficit will be more than 17% of GDP. The budget declaration we put in several scenarios. We're talking about the prospects that, yes, uncertainty is high, but finally, based on the 3-year financing, we are obliged to put in realistic figures and take into account both scenarios. At the same time, in the nearest future, we have to come to a conclusion which assumption we put in terms of the war in the budget of 2026. This is our current work. It's still in progress, also consulting the IMF, because at the moment in our current program with IMF, the assumption is that the war should be completed this year. We are seeing attacks to civil infrastructure. This certifies to the fact that Russia does not have a wish to stop the war at the moment. We see full destructive whenever Russia joins any type of negotiations. And in the nearest weeks, the situation does not change. We are planning the budget for 2026 based on the scenario that we would need to finance the armed forces at the level which is not less than in 2025. So we have some commitments from partners for 2026, 2027. Let me explain to you why we are based on this 2-year planning configuration of these commitments from partners. We have in 26 and 27, we have commitments for $37.4 billion. That includes financing from ERA loans with this initiative of the countries of J7. Correspondingly, for 26 and 27, the need in external financing at the moment is at the level of approximately $37.4 billion. So we are talking to partners about these uncovered needs. So the EU and the IMF on a daily basis are our counterparts in this dialogue. And in parallel, absolutely in a related manner, we talk about the activization of the work aimed at confiscation of the frozen Russian assets, which should become the resource for the reconstruction of the economic recovery of Ukraine. But now we are talking in the first place about covering of the first needs of the military, defense sector, security sector, and the needs at the expense of the external financing of the social part of the budget, something that we are directing our external financing throughout this martial law. Olga, many thanks. Immediately two clarifications about the scenario that you have mentioned in case we don't see throughout this promised by the President Trump within this promised 50 days, in case we don't see any principal changes, the situation with the Russian aggression and the Ministry of Finance is will continue to assume that the 2026 will see the continuation of the hostilities. That contradicts to the program of the IMF with the assumptions that are put inside that program. So evidently, I would like to ask this question to Yevgen, but what is the negotiation position of the Minister of Finances? Our negotiation position is always to start off from the reality. Definitely, both the IMF and the majority of the partners have shown flexibility to make sure we could structure the current program and have the possibility to implement such initiatives as aero loans and the like. But at the moment, take into account that the war is ongoing, we have to be absolutely realistic, have to be open, first of all, with IMF, what we are doing to make sure that the program configuration could be changed to fit the realities of the today. And the realities of the day are that we, at the moment, unfortunately, we don't see the decrease in the activity and the intensity of the hostilities or the absence of attacks of the Russian Federation on civil infrastructure, energy infrastructure. And taking into account all of these factors, we have an open dialogue both with IMF as well as with the European Union, who are already thinking on how to provide additional financing of this gap within the conditions that there will be several scenarios for the development of events for 26-27, because even the completion of the war or stopping of the hostilities does not mean the decrease of the needs. So this is connected also with our need in the further maintenance of the army and with our initiative that we have proposed called security service provision of capacity for the defense of Ukraine, for the security of Europe. All of these negotiations, they're coming in one and the same package. These are all very interrelated questions. We are talking about finance in the military law and also the finances in the post-war period. They will significantly depend, and they should, in the first place, cover the needs of the defense sector. So truly take into account today's very professional, very good discussion. I would add also International Monetary Fund to this discussion, who is being very active with us. We are permanently in discussions, and they understand that the change of this classical current four-year program, it should take place. In which form, in which format we will move with the fund, this is all at the moment is subject to our current negotiations. Many thanks, Olga. And before we move to the questions related to Mr. Gavin, in terms of this model, security as a service, let me explain what we mean by this. Several months ago, the Minister of Finances, Sergei Manchenko, at the meeting of the J7 ministers in Canada, he proposed the idea going away from financing our civil budget needs to financing our defense needs, which is basically coming out of the reality where we have to keep the Russian aggression from entering Europe. So what is in your bilateral negotiations? What is the response to this idea? Whether it is at all perceived by politicians of our main partners, or maybe it even helps them in a way that in their internal political negotiations they would get a better support in providing a more resilient financial assistance to Ukraine in the upcoming years. The point is, this idea is not something, is not a subject of discussion which requires any political will. This is that new reality to strengthen the security is absolutely a must. We are spending 26% of GDP on security and defense. And really, we have a powerful army with the military experience, with newest technologies, and basically, we are not protecting only Ukraine from the Russian Federation. We are really the shield of protection for Europe. And now the time has come to create this systemic decision, solution that will help us, together with the cooperating with partners, to preserve this configuration and to provide the protection of Europe from the Russian threat. About which elements are we talking, for instance? One of them is the potential participation of Ukraine in the initiative of safe security action for Europe. We understand that Ukraine will be allowed to part of this initiative, and we are also expecting that the countries of NATO will support Ukraine in terms of the increase of defense expenditures to their GDP, which is something which is being discussed. Also this year, the NATO countries are relooking their contribution to defense up to 1.5% of GDP. So this concept for us is also some new doors to include various forms of various defense investments. And this context, we are talking about the possibility of increasing expenditures to support Ukraine that will allow to improve the defense of the country, and it will allow all the participants of this system, will enable them to reach their targeted indicator. So we have a number of perspectives over which we are working already under the general umbrella of this idea that it's better to invest into strengthening of the defense capacity of Ukraine as already the most powerful army, other than scatter the budget and the forces and the political will as well for every big economy on a continent. That's why this idea appeared not so long time ago, but we already understand that at least among the J7 ministers of finances with whom we had conversation, and also from the European Commission, there is the understanding of the feasibility of such an idea implementation, and in all big platforms, including the meeting of the Ukrainian platform of donors, we already voiced up these initiatives to make sure that more partners and with bigger focus would join in to have this brainstorming how this idea should be implemented. Olga, many thanks. And my last question, it's a little bit about the future, but since we are already looking at the last months, when we have had so many budget-related news, some few days ago, the European Commission came up with their proposal for the upcoming 7-year budget period, 28 through 34, the so-called MFF, where they put in such a sly element as the Ukrainian reserve of some 100 billion euro for Ukraine's needs for this 7-year period. So already today, I saw in the news the first response to this budget, unfortunately from Germany, who already started to say that, oi, 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 this is in such a big increase of the European Union, we're not yet ready for this. We have to discuss. So to which extent do you already, or are you already included in such discussions? Do you see, I mean, of course I understand this is not hard commitments to European institutions, but at the political level, you returned with the minister from Rome, where evidently this was discussed. Is there any feeling that this is quite a protected article of IMF, where you already have a clear political will to preserve this 100 billion with any scenarios inside the EU? You said it absolutely right, that we possibly can't treat it as of today as a hard commitment, but as a soft commitment. We already treat it really as a soft commitment because we are already seeing as the support of the overwhelming majority of countries, exactly to make sure you could have this long-term prospects of the availability of financing exclusive for Ukraine in the framework of this MFF component in the amount of 100 billion euro, where the public leadership of the European Commission has already mentioned. Once again, we will be talking about covering the most urgent needs, both current and long-term, from the point of view of recovery financing. Because at the moment, we don't have access to those frozen Russian assets, which should be the main source for the reconstruction of Ukraine. The quicker Ukraine becomes able to renew, recover economic activity, engage in investment, the fewer, the less will be the need in the external financing. We do understand that we are ready to work over the increase of own capacity, including economic capacity, to become less and less dependent from such an external financing. But we are considering the instrument in the framework of MFF, which will be directed at the needs of Ukraine, as at the moment, once again, as a soft commitment, but really hope that it will move into the methodology of the IMF, into a hard commitment, and understanding that already potentially there is this framework of 2028, 2035, we are even more focused on the making sure that moving to this period throughout 26, 27 would be covered. This will allow us, once again, to grow internal capacity, economic, defense, and enter the stage of 28-35, as was mentioned by MFF with EU, together with our reforms in terms of European integration, at an already stable position. Thank you so much, Olga. I would even say that this is the financing which is quite fair. Poland received within the first 20 years in the European Union even less, 175 billion euro within various EU-financed programs, and didn't have the war. So we will not catch them up in case we don't get that financing. Also, for the protocol, I would like to remind you that this 100 billion are put in as non-repayable, so this will be not loans, and correspondingly, because very often they start the discussion, okay, they will give us the money, but then in the next generations are to return them. So the proposal of the European Commission, this money is the one that is not foreseen to be returned by Ukraine, no matter which legal form it will get. A small question before we move to Gavin and Roksolana, because this is the question in Q&A, since you have to run in a few minutes. This is the question, what has changed the position of our American partners in terms of the armed assistance to Ukraine, such as the changes to the budget were submitted by the government in a somewhat different geopolitical situation. Would that mean that the needs of financing ammunition will be less? In the first place, the changes to the budget that were submitted by the government, at least half of the increased money, they pertain to salaries to the military. So, announcement about new shipments of ammunition, this is not the case. We should, in the first place, provide the uninterrupted salary payment to the military until the end of the year. That's why we are adding money throughout the whole defense sector, particularly for this topic. In terms of increase of weapons and munitions, the need that we hear from the General Staff and the Minister of Defense by many times exceeds the increase of expenditures on defense foreseen by this budget. That's why the answer is no. The new announced shipments will not influence in any way on the necessity on approving these changes to the budget. Many thanks to Roksolana. I wanted to post into our chat some collection on electronic warfare, because it does say that we really have a lot of uncovered needs in weapons and munitions.
And now, Gavin, it's time for you. I have an unusual privilege for a moderator to outsource questions to the previous speakers. Like my general perception was that I will ask you about your general evaluation of Ukrainian financial stability right now, and certainly there was a question regarding the design of the current program and the need to change this program or to move to the new program. However, Roksolana and Olga put very direct questions to the IMF, and you are the best person to address them. So the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much for the invitation to this event, and I've appreciated the discussion so far. Both I think the factual update from Alexandra, which was very useful, and also the comments from Roksolana and Olga. I would say I think the discussion so far has done a good job at zeroing in on the key issues. I think the budgetary performance so far this year has been good. The supplementary budget has been well designed, and we have very much appreciated the budget declaration. Second time since the start of the full-scale war, but I think that was a extremely helpful strategic planning document which sets the scene. I mean, to pick up on a couple of points, I think, as has already emerged in this conversation, the question is, which scenario are we in? The budget declaration indeed had two scenarios. One aligned with the latest review of the IMF program, where the war comes to winds down this year, and then a second scenario where it lasts longer. And that, of course, is the critical issue which will need to be resolved before the budget for 2026 is submitted to Parliament on September 15th. I would say that, of course, all partners who are engaged in Ukraine follow events on a day-to-day basis. We can see that there could be indeed a scenario where more financing is required. Donors are focused on this, but I think it's important to. I mean, we're waiting for the government's decision, the finance ministry's proposal in the budget, and I think that will trigger more detailed analysis. Of course, this is all happening in a context where there is a new government in Ukraine. So we are certainly interested to have a dialogue about the other policies of the new government. That is, of course, extremely relevant for the medium-term fiscal picture. But it's clear, I think, to everyone that over the course of the next couple of months, this will be a time when key decisions need to be made. Now, maybe moving on to a few words about the IMF's engagements. The program, the EFF, was approved in early 2023. Performance has been strong. We've completed 8 reviews. This is a record for Ukraine's engagement, and I think there's been a good dynamic at place. As Olga alluded to, the IMF has been flexible in this program. It's been the appropriate approach in the midst of a full-scale war. But also Ukraine has delivered. Ukraine has delivered a very strong package of reforms, and that has been important because at a time when Ukraine has been very dependent on external financing, it has been very important for us and other partners to be able to say to all stakeholders that despite the war, Ukraine is continuing with reforms. That confidence has been, that performance has been essential to sustain high-level external financing. Now, maybe just a few words about financing and sustainability. Now, every country is case by case. The Roksolana mentioned another IMF member, but we've tailored this program to Ukraine's circumstances. I would say, above all, what Ukraine needs is highly concessional financing. The IMF doesn't provide financing of the same degree of concessionality as the European Union and other partners. We play our part, but I would say when we look at a path for Ukraine to restore sustainability, long-term financing on highly concessional terms, or ideally grant financing, or indeed support for defense, such as some of the ideas which Olga mentioned, what is the ideal approach? Because, of course, everyone wants Ukraine to return to a sustainable position where debts are manageable. And so not only the budget gaps can be closed for the near term, but to avoid a situation where Ukraine is over-indebted and the post-war reconstruction phase is slowed down. But then maybe the final point I'd make is, of course, the restoration of sustainability does require Ukraine to continue delivering on reforms. And I think everyone needs to be aware is that the phrase which often comes up is burden sharing. I think it's crucial in these circumstances where expenditure may be higher, that the strong tax performance which we've seen so far this year is sustained. So perhaps if I pause there, hopefully that gives you a different perspective on some of the issues which have come up. Back to you, Hlib. Thank you.
Yeah, Gavin, thank you. I have now one question to you. You were very diplomatic on many issues that were raised by colleagues from the government and Rada. However, what is your own feeling about next 2 years? Do you, from the conversations with key member states that both vote at the IMF board meetings, but also provide financial support to Ukraine? Are you confident about covering Ukrainian needs for 2026-27? Do you see the strong political commitment? Do you believe that it is just a technical thing, both on the side of Ukrainian partners and the IMF also, because maybe in this scenario of continued armed conflict of the current scale, the program will need to be redesigned or relaunched in some way. Not speaking about technical details, I understand it's just too early, but do you see the political will to resolve this issue from key stakeholders?
What I see is the following. The political commitment is there. You see that from continuing statements from, I would say, key European partners. There is already, it has already been mentioned in this conversation, the European Commission's proposal for 2028 onwards. So consequently, I would say all partners supporting Ukraine have started to focus on this issue of the next 2 years. So this is the right question to ask. Where I think we are at is we need to, I would say, if I think about our engagement and our counterparts in Ukraine, it's important to move beyond to sort of general statements about there could be challenges in 2026 to be more specific. Our partners like numbers to decimal places, so generalities will not do enough. And in terms of our next engagement, it will be to, as has been mentioned already, to have an in-depth discussion on the budget for 2026, because we want to essentially reassess the assessment of the financing gap. Maybe it'll be similar to the existing numbers, maybe it'll be larger, but we need to have. Basically, we need to move the discussion forward, because if Ukraine needs additional financing, a good story needs to be sold. We want to have numbers which won't move around. that it also does depend. I mentioned the sort of new government's policies. There also has to be clarity about the government's strategy in the wider set of reforms. I'd say that's been the experience since the start of the full-scale war. Ukraine has received exceptional amounts of external financing, but it's dependent on solid numbers and solid also commitments from the Ukrainian side. So in that respect, I think we are in a similar situation than in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin.
Unfortunately, I can't help reminding about Ukraine's obligations within IMF program until end of July to appoint the BEP head, which, looking at the reply of the new Prime Minister in the Parliament, we will unlikely to fulfill on time, because she said she insists on a new round of searching the head rather than appointing the one that was selected by the Commission. And the Center of Economic Strategy also joined the application of other NGOs and business associations with the request to come back to the decision and to appoint the head that was selected by the Commission based on the honest competition. But whether this step is going to be necessary, as Gavin said, to make sure we could show the relevant strategy in terms of the commitments that we already have in the program, this is yet to be seen. Olena, from the one hand you have a good, on the other hand you have a different role to make sure we could really have only independent of any institutions without any limitations. So you could say it and mention your position to the extent how everything as is was said by the officials, be it the Parliament, the Ministry, or the IMF, whether your evaluation of the situation coincides with what's been said. And of course, in our audience, there are always, and the ones who are looking at the products, we have a lot of participants of the financial markets. We are a little bit discussing it as macroeconomists, as people who are engaged into the state policy, that there is the gap that needs to be closed. But it's all seen by the people who are keeping the money in Ukraine, be it the Ukrainian citizens or the international financial investors. So how do you see the situation, and whether you have any comments, any additional thoughts about the questions that were raised today? Good afternoon. Many thanks to Hlib, many thanks to all previous speakers for their thoughts and opinions. It seems to me that we have more or less the consensus that the problem with financing for the upcoming year and also 2027 is likely quite acute. This is a very proper approach. I support the approach to have two scenarios, but it seems to me already now, taking into account that we are already in the middle of the year, to choose which scenario, we don't really have that much time left. And from point of view of the security of the state, we should continue looking at the continuation of the war scenario. In case the situation improves, we will find the way out. We'll know what to do. This will not be a problem. But morally, after around September, once the budget is there to search for new money, this is not going to be really safe approach. That's why I would like to summarize some figures and give my evaluations. This year, the deficit of the budget, as is taking into account the changes that were proposed by the government and which the Parliament supported in the first reading, in case we take the current course, which is unlikely to change significantly until the end of the year, so like 45 until the end of the year. And at least if we look at the average rate of 42 hryvnia, the deficit is $45 million. So the main $45 billion. And we want to engage 6 billion from internal market, some additional revenues, and of course we count on international support. This is quite an optimistic plan, because our main source for this internal engagement, it is the banking system. The banking system already for 2 years has lended to the government some $10 billion in equivalent. This was the main source. These are the internal borrowings. And as a result, the share of government bonds in the bank's portfolio has grown significantly. It is not as we had in 2020, 27%, but it's already going there. It's 25%, but it's not really equal in the banks. Some state-owned banks keep 45% of their assets in government bonds. That's quite an indicator which is very high, and the possibility to grow the portfolio in government bonds is quite limited, taking into account that the banks have started a more active lending because there is demand, which is very good. So I think it will be more realistic to some 3 billion. I think it's a more realistic figure, maybe the same amount next year. And basically, this will be enough to make sure you can pay under the external debts, because factually all deficit of the budget will be financed at the expense of the external international assistance. Luckily, this year we're getting much more of it this year, depending on how quickly we will be fulfilling our obligations within Ukraine facility. This will be more than $50 billion. So we will come to the next year with some balance even. But nevertheless, in case next year nothing changes and we will have the deficit, and in case the budget will be some $44-45 billion, then the needs of additional financing will be around $9-10 billion. And that's what we are saying only about 2026, where part of the financing is already provided. So this year, we basically we have really little estimation for the next year's new revenues. Take into account the current situation. The main objective right now of the government, of the updated government, is to still focus on this provision of the external financing. And it seems to me that still Ukraine will be forced to make its homework, because there are areas where there is a lot of deviation from tax payment, meaning tax evasion. There are some areas which are not taxed, so we do have some gaps in the legislation. This is not the subject for our today's discussion. There could be even a separately mentioned that I was impressed quite significantly recently. This was the updated information from the National Bank about the postal shipments that Ukrainians abroad receive. The National Bank received access to the anonymized data, depersonalized data, and they counted that such parcels were 3.5 and within last year. And this first quarter, $1.5 billion. And it's going to be 6 total of the year. We don't know how much of it is being taxed. This is one of the examples that you could still find some internal sources of increasing revenues into the budget without increasing the tax rates. Because increase the tax rates, that's the simplest solution, but it factually punishes the ones who are already paying. So in the first place, the question is, and the homework that needs to be done by our authorities is to find the sources without increasing the tax rates. I would also like to comment that from the point of view of the external financing, I fully agree that it's very important for Ukraine to have it at the most possible preferential conditions. We didn't raise the topic of the state debt, but it's almost 90% of GDP. So in case if we continue to lend, even under very preferential conditions, this will be creating a big burden, debt burden. So it's important for Ukraine to receive this irrevocable assistance to the fullest. Thank you. Thank you, Olena. I would also like to add about your postal shipments. It's evident that it's quite a discussionable question in our state policy. We have an immediate comment in the chat about this, but this cap really impresses. 6 billion, it's really a lot. If we talk about the quarter figure of 1.5 billion. But even what we looked at several years ago, 8 billion hryvnia, Ukraine did not receive from the VAT on imports of electric cars. I mean, I understand in case we would buy Teslas, still the question would be how geopolitically this could help us. But now Ukraine is becoming the exhibition of Chinese electric automobiles. Why do we need this? So evidently we should also close these gaps and see them, and we will continue to pay attention to this. I would like to really thank everybody who has participated in our today's discussion, and to our colleagues, my colleagues, Sasha, who has prepared this topic, Roksolana, Olga, many thanks for being all the time with us, Gavin for his that he had to reply to a lot of complicated questions and very often political questions that are quite important for Ukraine. Olena, many thanks to you too. Always appreciate that you are not only providing us with some precious independent assessment, looking at the financial markets, but also as the member of the supervisory board of our organization, you are always contributing to make sure we could do specialized events as good as possible. I would like to wish everybody very nice rest of the day and safe, quiet weekend, to make sure that they would run like the beginning of the week without the massive shellings, to make sure we could have more energy to resolve complicated issues, the ones that we have discussed today. We were able to close in within 1.5 hours. Many thanks to everybody who have participated.